Hello, my name is Alex Isles and welcome. In today's episode we're going to be looking at the Anglo-Saxon Germanic tradition of Yule. Welcome back. It's great to have you with us, and today we're going to be looking at the Anglo-Saxon pagan tradition of Yule. Now, on the 25th of December, the Germanic pagans worshipped Yule, which apparently was a festival dedicated to the heathen Mother's Night. Now, we only know very little about this because of the Venerable Bede. And Bede was a historian who was working up here in the northeast of England, and he wrote a number of different books. He wrote Ecclesiastical History of the English Peoples, he wrote On the Nature of Time, and a number of other books. And during these he mentioned some of the pre-Christian traditions. Unfortunately with Yule, it's a really short section of his book. In fact, it's only about one line long, where he goes, Yule was called this because it was named the Heathen Mother's Night, a name bestowed upon it, I suspect, on account of the ceremonies performed while waiting this night through. And that's pretty much all we know about it. So that's led to a number of speculations from historians and trying to figure out what that means. Some historians have definitely taken this and they've gone with it and thought, well, maybe it's a fertility night, and they've actually maybe suggested that ritual sex was performed on this night to bring in the new year. On the shortest day, you're worried that the world will not start again. A fertility rite, the idea of bringing new life into the world, those sort of things are all brought together. But again, it's all inferred from about 2 lines that Bede says within his book On the Nature of Time. So we are really working with the bare minimum to actually understand maybe some of the traditions that are going on in the 5th, 6th and early 7th centuries in Anglo-Saxon England. Now, we can start looking at some of the other traditions in other parts of Europe, but again, it's very thin on the ground what we actually have to work with. And we maybe have a chance of looking at some of this stuff by looking at the Icelandic sagas. Now, the problem again is I'm going to make a massive warning before I start talking about this, because when we're looking at the Icelandic sagas, we have to know the context of when these sagas are actually put forwards. Now, there is a lot in the Icelandic sagas that we can look at and go, yeah, because of oral tradition being passed down, there is a lot that we can actually say, yeah, this is accurate, this is probably good, this tells us about Scandinavian lifestyles and how things were going. But the warnings I want to say is, first of all, it talks about a Scandinavian context. So we're looking at Norway, we're looking at Sweden, we're looking at Denmark, we're looking at Iceland. These are Scandinavian rather than Anglo-Saxon Britain, and also the traditions going on amongst the peoples of the British Isles who are pagan at this time. The next thing we have to take into account is the fact that, secondly, the Icelandic sagas are written down in the 12th century mostly. So they're written down in monasteries and they're written down by people who are Christian. Now, when they're written down in monasteries, we have to understand that there is going to be an element of lost in translation. These are being written down by people who are, yes, within the culture, but they've also been brought up as Christians, so because of that, there may be small nuances that they just don't understand with the festivals and what's going on. Secondly, they're also probably trying to show elements of the fact that there is a better way of life in the Christian tradition, so they've got their biases of their own faith versus the old paganism. And there's elements which I'll touch upon this and we'll sort of draw elements from it as well. So when we look at this Yule from the Scandinavian context, we're looking at a 12th century saga written down talking about the 10th century. So we're looking at a period, it's written about 1100 AD, and it's talking about the period of around about the 900s. And it's the saga of Hakon the Good, who is a Norwegian who propagates Christianity within Norway. So we're looking again at someone who is, Hakon the Good is bringing Christianity in, and it's in juxtaposition with the Norse faith, also the pre-existing Norse paganism that's going on in that region at that time. So it starts off with them all gathering together at the temple, and there's feasting and drinking for a long period of time. So it's 3 days of feasting and drinking. animals and livestock are brought to the temple, and when they're brought to the temple, they're ritually sacrificed and their blood is gathered. When their blood's gathered, they then take that blood and they smear it onto the idols within the temple. So these would have been idols that would have been dedicated to the Norse gods. So there would probably be one dedicated to Odin, probably to Thor, to Tyr, to Freya, Frigga, these deities there as well. So they would be inside the temple and they would just smear the blood onto them, and then following on that they would cover the temple on the inside and outside in blood, then take the remainder of the blood and then throw it or scatter it over the congregation. And so when they're scattering that blood over the congregation, that is the beginning of the whole festival. Now, my wonder as well about this is I'm seeing some similarities to some of the Old Testament Bible, where there's sacrifices of animals within the temple, and then there's a scattering of blood over the congregation, the old Israelite congregation. My wonder is, are the monks trying to show a difference where there's obviously in the Bible, the Old Testament, and then the coming of Christ. And when you have the coming of Christ, there is no longer a need for sacrifices anymore. So possibly, is there an element where they're sneaking in some references to the Old Testament, and then they're bringing that in to the Yule festival as well? On the counterpoint though, we do know animal sacrifice was practiced by peoples across Europe, and especially the Germanic peoples as well. So I have no problem in believing that this is an actual part of the worship that the Germanic peoples would have conducted in both Scandinavia and also in Britain as well. So there's something there as well. We've also got a site up here in Northumberland, in the northeast of England, just outside of a town called Wooler in Northumberland, and this is a place called Adgefren. It's mentioned also by the Venerable Bede as well, and Adgefren was a site where they had a royal palace belonging to some of the kings of Northumbria. When they were excavating, they discovered a hall, and it was full of cattle bones. And when it was full of cattle bones, it may be that this is something similar to what we're seeing here with this Yule festival, where the king is gathered together, animals are sacrificed, and there's worship there as well. And there's a possibility of a pagan site on that site as well, which was built into a prehistoric mound. So there's a number of different sites there which are prehistoric, then reused by the pagans later on, which you'll see. So we've got all of that going on there. Following on from that, after the blood has been scattered, we then have a fire lit in the center of the temple. When the fire's lit, there's a kettle and they're put over the top and they start boiling the meat. And the meat is then gathered around people as well. Another thing to point out as well is that horses are mentioned as one of the animals that are sacrificed. And it's really interesting because in Anglo-Saxon England, it was illegal to eat horse flesh. Now, is this because of the price of horses and the fact they're such a high status animal that you can't kill them because they're so important to the economy and the requirements for lords, for war, the connection with kingship, all of that sort of thing? Or is it also because of the fact that horses are killed and eaten amongst the Germanic tradition? So maybe they're trying to cut off the Germanic tradition by making it illegal to eat horse flesh, because obviously that is a thing that is done in France, in Belgium, places like that. People still eat horses over there, but amongst the British people, we don't eat horses. So again, very interesting one to look at. And there's a possibility that that again is trying to stop the old pagan traditions and again focus people onto the Christian traditions instead. So when you have that, the meat is boiled and then they start doing toasts. There is a ceremonial sacrificial beaker that is then carried around the fire and then brought to the chieftain, and the chieftain blesses it. And then following on from that, the meat is then cooked, and then there are toasts. So they start off with toasts to the gods. So they do a toast to Odin, and then they do a toast to Freya, and then they do a toast to Njord. And they're doing toasts to honor the gods, and this is for the benefit of health, the benefit of peace, and alongside that as well for peace and the continuation of good harvests. So all of this is going on at that time. You then have toasts to the king's health, and also toasts to the dead as well. So there is a lot of drinking and feasting going on, and this feast lasts for 3 days. during this 3-day period, there is to be no violence. So again, similar to the Roman tradition, you can't declare war during Saturnalia. Well, during Yule, there's a 3-day period where no violence must be conducted and no fighting. So again, you see a continuation of the idea this is a time of peace, of bringing together, and of food and drink to be brought. We can also look at contemporary letters from the late 6th century written by Christians as they're coming across to the British Isles to convert the Germanic Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. And we actually have a letter written to St. Augustine, who is the apostle to the Anglo-Saxons in Kent, by Gregory the Great. And in this letter, Gregory the Great says the following: "Because they are accustomed to slaying many oxen in sacrifice to demons, some solemnity must be put in place of this. They must make bowers of branches of trees around those churches which have been changed from heathen temples, and they may celebrate the solemnity with religious feasting. Nor let them now sacrifice animals to the devil, but for the praise of God kill animals for their own eating." So you can see as well now where they've got this festival where they are killing and sacrificing animals, and you can see again it's focused in on cattle. So when they've got that tradition going on, maybe there was an Anglo-Saxon version of what we see in the Icelandic sagas. And with this Anglo-Saxon version, they are sacrificing animals. And so you can see that Gregory the Great, when he's talking to Augustine, is saying to him, right, what you have to do is get them to move away from their pagan gods and instead have a feast instead dedicated to Jesus and to the solemnity of that time of year. And so it's an interesting transition where they see that there's existing rites, but they then have to use them to basically help the Christian mission at that time to grow and develop and move people away from old beliefs towards the new beliefs of Christianity. Where we're now going to look at the Anglo-Saxon Christian tradition during this period. So what better way to start off looking at Anglo-Saxon Christmas than to really set the scene? Because to an Anglo-Saxon Christian, Christmas was not the most important time of the year. Now, I would risk saying this, and I'm pretty happy to say this, that Christmas is the biggest festival in the Western world's calendar at the moment. Whether if that's celebrated in the Christian tradition, or if you're doing it in a secular manner where it's a gathering with friends and family and food and all of those sort of things. But that hasn't always been the case. Back in the Anglo-Saxon period, the most important festival of the year was Easter for the Anglo-Saxon Christians. And the reason why is because that's the time of year when Christ was crucified and died for people's sins, and there was a forgiveness for sins, and therefore that was seen as the most important part of the Christian religious calendar. And that continued through the Middle Ages until very much the early modern period, and then in the Victorian period, that's when we start seeing Christmas overtaking Easter as the most important Christian celebration. But to an Anglo-Saxon, Christmas would have been important because it was obviously the birth of Christ, his entering into the world, and the importance of the fact that he was God through a virgin birth and things like that. But overall, it wasn't as important as Easter when you obviously have the forgiveness of sins. So there's an interesting one for you right there. So when you've got that in your mind, you then have to look at how Christmas was celebrated and what it was viewed as during the Anglo-Saxon period. Now we do start seeing the growth of Christmas as a festival during this period because of the fact that during this period we actually see Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, get crowned on Christmas Day. Now when he gets crowned on Christmas Day, this sets a tradition for European kings. They want to be crowned on Christmas Day because of the connections with Jesus. Obviously, if the greatest king, the King of Kings within the Christian faith, is born on that day, if you're a king, if you're crowned on that day, then you're sort of fitting in with the whole story of Jesus, that point where royal kingship is then connected, obviously, to the Christian God. And you see this later on with William the Conqueror also getting crowned on Christmas Day in 1066. So there's a continuation of that as you enter into the Middle Ages, as we sort of view them within history. But when you've got that tradition going on, obviously Christmas was also seen as important slightly earlier on, where we have an Anglo-Saxon bishop, or the Archbishop of York, Egbert of York, setting out the 12 days of Christmas. And the 12 days of Christmas back then were days of fasting, attending vigils, going to Christmas services, and giving out alms and gifts to your friends, your families, and to monasteries. And so that was how you framed it back then. That was a time of reflection, at a time of the year when the world seemed dead. You have no leaves on the trees, you've probably got snow on the ground's hard and icy, the sky is grey. It's a time when the world seems to have died, and then you have Christ entering the world, bringing life and light into it. And so you'd have that focus on Jesus and that focus on his birth during the Christmas period for the Anglo-Saxons. Those services would come and become very important as you have people gathering together to celebrate that bringing of life into the world and that forgiveness of sin through Jesus. The gift giving as well was very important because there was a sort of importance of giving gifts to the poor. So that was in a form of Christian charity, and then also giving gifts to one another. So you'd see the more powerful in society giving gifts to their retainers, to their lords, and keeping up that social connection at that time of year. But also you'd see gifts being given as well to monasteries, so the monasteries could then do their work of caring for the poor as well. And then that expanded throughout the rest of the Anglo-Saxon period and became more and more important. The Anglo-Saxon king Alfred the Great, a king of Wessex, he actually saw this as a very, very important time of year, and he really stepped up his importance of Christmas. And so he would worship and really staunchly kept those 12 days as a time of prayer and fasting. And there's a couple of different reasons for this. First of all, Alfred was a deeply religious man, and so this was seen as a part of his expression of his faith, his expression of his Christianity. But alongside this as well, his stepmother was actually the great-granddaughter of Charlemagne. So he had that connection with Charlemagne and the importance of that time of year when Charlemagne had been crowned, but also the fact that the prayer, the fasting, all of that would be connected in with his understanding of his faith as a Christian at that time. So he sees that as very important, and even though that caused for him to have trouble later on, because some historians have suggested that he lost against the Vikings in 878 because of the fact that he had so strictly kept the 12 days of Christmas with the fasting that his army was weak and wasn't able to fight against the Viking invaders at that time. Though overall he did finally win, and he then proceeded to lay the foundations of what would become England as we recognise it today. So that sort of brought forwards Christmas with that following of the 12 days of Christmas, the crowning of kings, and the time of year when kings would choose to be crowned due to the connection to Christianity, and that time of prayer, fasting, focusing on vigils and gift giving to both the monasteries and the poor that set up the foundation of Anglo-Saxon Christmas as we understand it. And it's actually the Anglo-Saxons themselves that gave us the word Christmas, or Christ's Mass. And so when they created that, they then that was first recorded in 1038. And so we get the word for Christmas from the Anglo-Saxons themselves. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's episode. You've been able to understand how the Christian Anglo-Saxons would celebrate Christmas and how that festival looked for them at that time of year. As always, please do like and subscribe, share the video with your friends, and I look forward to telling you more stories about history in the near future. Until then though, stay safe and well, and Merry Christmas.